Good evening, everyone. I'm Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and welcome to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. Whether you are watching on Crowdcast or Facebook Live, we are glad that you could join us, and we're excited to be back after the winter break. So thanks for being here. If you're new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical campaign training and facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics. So exactly a week ago today, as everybody knows, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were sworn into office. So it's week one of the Biden-Harris administration. We have already seen a record number of women nominated for the cabinet. Several have already been, of course, confirmed by the Senate, including Janet Yellen as the first female Treasury Secretary. There's an all-female communications team, and Biden has already taken action on several matters, ranging from creating a White House Gender Policy Council to reviving the plan to put Harriet Tubman on a $20 bill. So, there's a female vice president who will be spending a lot of her time breaking ties in the 50-50 Senate. So lots and lots to talk about this evening, and we are super excited to have with us CNN's newly announced White House correspondent, MJ Lee. MJ has spent the last year plus covering the Biden campaign. She spent the last 2+ months back and forth to Delaware, where she covered the transition. And just last week, CNN, of course, announced her as a key part of their White House team. So thank you, MJ, for being with us. And we want to let everybody else know, too, that we are going to be taking plenty of questions. So please feel free to drop those in the bottom of the screen under the Ask the Question queue, and we'll save some time for that. And if you miss any of today's program, there will be a link for a replay available at the same site that you used to register. So welcome, MJ. How has your first week on the new beat been?
Well, first of all, Betsy, thank you so much for having me. It is fun to be here, especially at such an important time with so much news going on and just a week into the new administration. The first week as a White House correspondent has been interesting for a number of reasons, most of them kind of personal. So for those of you who don't know this, I'm actually based in New York City, so I'm not in Washington, D.C., and I've been a political correspondent at CNN based in New York the entire time, though, usually political correspondents happen to be based in Washington, D.C. I've been here. It doesn't really matter when you're on the campaign trail because it just is a difference of what airport you're traveling out of. So I've been here and first covered the Elizabeth Warren campaign and then moved over to cover Biden closer to the general election. And now that I'm covering the White House, the move back to DC will eventually need to happen for myself and my family, but that hasn't quite happened yet. So the idea of sort of covering the White House from far away, I think under normal circumstances would be even more unusual and difficult, but we are in the middle of the pandemic, and as it is, it's pretty limited, the number of reporters that we are sending into the White House, as you all know, because of sort of the safety precautions that everyone is taking. So it's both unusual, but we are in the middle of this COVID crisis, and so you have to sort of find ways to keep reporting without physically being in DC, and that's been an interesting experience so far. But so far, so good.
Good. So what is your just early assessment, since you will be part of that White House team, your impression of sort of the press relationship between the White House and the press corps? Obviously, sort of the days of maybe the fake news is over from the White House podium. But what do you see generally in terms of the Biden administration's willingness for access and some transparency in this new administration just out of the gate?
Yeah, I mean, I think the contrast has been so stark, even in these early, first days. Mm-hmm. that relationship between, and I obviously didn't cover the last White House, but I did cover the Trump campaign, was so sort of fraught, and fake news just became this phrase that so many people ended up using because it came directly from the former president himself, right? And towards the end, these press briefings were not even regular. And I think the fact that the Biden administration right out of the gate is sort of making sure that they are showing and trying to demonstrate that this is an important part of sort of the White House press corps and White House comm shop relationship, is making sure that they regularly have White House press briefings. And also, it hasn't been limited to the press briefings, but also briefings of other kinds, right? The biggest challenge that they face right now, and the most immediate challenge, is COVID. And so we, saw today the first COVID briefing that was led by the experts and the scientists who are on Biden's COVID team. So I think in all different kinds of ways, they're trying to signal for now that, they want to be accessible. They at least want to create forums where reporters get the opportunity to regularly ask questions. And, obviously, I think that is a really good thing and encouraging.
So what is your, just before we get into a lot of the other topics around gender, I just, sort of news of the week, if you will, wanted just to get your thoughts on where things stand with not only COVID relief, but sort of this vaccine distribution process that's going to be hopefully sped up here in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I think the most important thing and the most notable thing is how singularly focused the Biden White House has been on COVID, just in terms of the issues that they are talking about, the kinds of briefings that they are holding, obviously the actions that the president himself has taken already. The first sort of themed day, and this is what the Biden White House is trying to do in these early days, is have days that are dedicated to a specific theme. Today was climate change, for example. The first full day that he was in office was entirely dedicated to COVID. So I think the most notable thing is how much they are stressing that really there is no other single issue that is more important and more urgent for them to deal with than COVID. It's early. It has just been a week, but I do think, we are about to transition pretty quickly from the beginning stages of, hey, we're new in town and we are just, getting into the White House, getting settled. And particularly because transparency was such an issue with the former administration, trying to get our heads around what exactly the situation is with COVID vaccine distributions, supplies, production, all of the above, and shifting to, well, how many days will it take for you to actually have a clear sense of where things stand, and really being sort of demanded to answer those important questions, right? I don't know that we're quite there yet, but I do think, especially if you listen to some of the questions that they're getting asked by reporters in these settings, you are starting to see a little bit more of, well, why is it taking so long that you don't have answers to X, Y, and Z? And I think that's only going to get amplified as we get further into the administration.
Yeah, that makes sense. So give us a sense, we mentioned earlier, of course, the record number of women in very diverse cabinet. Give us a sense, and Janet Yellen, of course, just being sworn in, about the prospects for this cabinet all getting through the confirmation process, and what you see notable. I mean, there's so many different components of this, but what you see notable in sort of the rollout and the folks coming into the cabinet, especially women, of course.
Yeah, I think you can't stress enough how much it has been a priority for Biden and his closest advisors in the incoming administration to have diversity reflected in these top roles. It's something he talked about a ton during the campaign. It's something he really, really emphasized during the transition as well, you know, often saying the line, I am determined to have a cabinet and a government that really reflects and looks like the rest of America. And his, you know, key promise was that his government will be, his cabinet at least, will be the most diverse that the country has ever seen. And, you know, so far, based on the nominations and the appointments that we have seen, he is very much on track to keep that promise. Obviously, there are different kinds of diversity, but the gender diversity has been such a big focus for him. You already mentioned, you know, even on a staff level, you know, it was a big deal when they announced that the comms team leadership would be entirely female. Someone like Janet Yellen, you know, becoming a first. So there have been a lot of firsts in this administration already, and I think they're, you know, very much on track to keep that core promise of there being diversity. You know, I think there are a lot of discussions to be had, and, you know, we can have that discussion here on sort of what counts as sort of checking the box diversity versus what counts as diversity that I think matters to people who are watching this closely. You know, it's not just about counting the number of women or counting the number of, you know, people of color in these important roles. I think it's also about, well, what kinds of roles are they in? What kinds of, you know, what kinds of portfolios do these people hold? So I think it's a complicated topic, and I think it is not just about making a list and, you know, checking off the names and counting the number of people that sort of check the boxes being diverse.
Well, and you alluded to this too. It is those kind of positions. Whereas, for example, you know, back to the Janet Yellen, traditionally not having seen women in some of the top economic policy roles. But in the Defense Department, a number of women now appointed to very high level, you know, undersecretary, deputy secretary jobs in the Pentagon. Those two areas in particular, to me, kind of jump out as, you know, the areas that we really haven't seen a lot of women serving in.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the more interesting things that really stood out to me during the transition process, and I'm not sharing anything that we haven't publicly reported, but, you know, somebody who was seen as being just like a lock for a cabinet position was Michelle Flournoy.
Right.
Everybody you talk to in the earliest days, you know, if you ask them, you know, give me your predictions of who is most likely to get which very prominent role.
The DC Parlor Game, right, MJ?
Yeah, exactly. And her name, as I'm sure you know, would come up probably the most frequently as, this is a done deal. Nobody else is going to get this job. She is a lock for defense, and everybody knows this. And then what ended up happening was that Tony Blinken ended up being nominated for Secretary of State. There was talk, of course, about whether Susan Rice could end up getting that nomination. But remember, this was at a point where the Georgia Senate races the runoff races had not happened. And so the power structure of the Senate was not yet clear. And so what our reporting had shown at the time was that ended up sort of triggering this domino effect where Tony Blinken had gotten the Secretary of State nomination. Janet Yellen had been nominated for Treasury Secretary. And then you are sort of looking around and realizing, well, for at least the big four typical cabinet positions that people talk about, this sort of realization within the Biden world, well, we probably can't have all four of those people be white. So, I mean, this is what I mean about, and of course, Flournoy didn't end up getting that nomination.
Yeah.
This is what I mean by sort of like different kinds of diversity that we're talking about. I think it's the year 2021, and Michelle Flournoy being a woman in a sense sort of wasn't enough. Like, there was such a push, and the Biden team was feeling so much pressure to make sure that there was other kind of diversity that was being reflected in these top roles. And so ultimately, this person who was seen as being such a lock for this very important, prominent job didn't end up getting it. And we know for a fact that diversity ended up being a really big factor.
That's interesting. I mean, and you mentioned sort of the political pressure component that has gone on. Talk talk a little bit more about that sort of behind the scenes in this process, and Biden's administration, listening to various, I guess, interest groups might be the right word, to try to kind of formulate this cabinet, and what sort of impact, I guess, do some of these groups have, not only in the cabinet nomination process and staffing, but now thinking, policy-wise, and prioritizing various pieces of policy as well, right?
Right. And I do think we should be, very clear to anybody watching that we are not talking about some new dynamic. This is not, new to the Biden administration. For, every incoming White House and every incoming administration, of course, like, you are always facing pressure from, whether it's different interest groups or different demographic groups. And frankly, people who supported you during the campaign, right? And I think this is definitely the case for Joe Biden. This is during his campaign, this is a man who, at a certain point during the primaries, people thought his campaign was over. His campaign was totally flailing. And then you get to South Carolina, and it was definitely with the help of Black voters that he was able to revive his campaign. I mean, he talks openly about that. His advisors talk openly about that. And I do think there's a certain amount of making sure that the decisions that you make, once you're in office, sort of reflect the diversity of different people, different groups of people who supported you and helped you get there. I think obviously the sort of more cynical way of phrasing that is sort of paying your dues to the people who supported you and, helped you during the campaign. I think they probably wouldn't put it that way. They would probably say, like, diversity matters on its for its own sake, and we would be doing these things and being cognizant about diversity anyway. But yes, politics is at play, and I think different kinds of pressure that you get from different kinds of people who have different interests, that is always at play, and I think the Biden administration is no exception.
Are there any positions, since we now have a 50-50 Senate and a majority leader, Schumer, are there any of the cabinet nominations that could be dicey? I know early on people were talking about Neera Tanden at OMB potentially having issues, but what are you hearing from that realm? Yeah,
I mean, that was our reporting during the earlier days pre-inauguration. That the way that it was described to me was, by a Republican source, was there's nobody on the list of nominees that Biden had whose nomination is in more trouble and would have the most, more difficulty than Neera Tanden for OMB. Obviously, the dynamics have changed a lot, as you said, because the makeup of the Senate is now clear, but at least in the earlier days, her nomination was the one that really seemed to upset Republicans and some Democrats too. But this was the one person who, folks seem to say, yeah, we are okay with so many of the others that Biden has nominated, but Neera Tanden, we are not going to be okay with her.
Well, we'll see how that plays out. You mentioned the portfolio of some of the cabinet secretaries. And of course, I wanted to drill down a little bit on the vice president. Obviously a historic role that she is undertaking. What is your sense, just from, having reported on her, of course, during the election and transition, and now, what do you see as kind of the major portfolio that she is going to have in this administration, and what it may mean for her politically down the line?
Yeah, I mean, to be very honest with you, I do think it is too early. I don't know that even, Kamala Harris's closest advisors could tell you or could, precisely predict right now, this is going to be her portfolio. And you know, I think the vice president herself has said as much in some interview settings where she was asked, you know, what is exactly the role that you are going to play? And I think she's been pretty clear in saying publicly, the role that I'm going to play is to support the president in whatever endeavors he is undertaking. You know, obviously it's an interesting dynamic because the president that she is working alongside is a former vice president. And, you know, Biden is somebody who talked a lot about that working relationship between himself and former President Barack Obama. And when he was choosing his own VP, he really wanted to emulate that because it was a working relationship that in many ways worked really well for him. So, you know, I do think that this would be a more, I would have more insight, and we would all probably have a little more insight into what kind of, you know, VP Kamala Harris will be if we were having this discussion a couple of months from now. But look, since this is a lot about gender dynamics and gender and politics, I do think there's a really fascinating discussion about the decision to choose Kamala Harris and sort of the process that Biden and his advisors went through even in the earliest days in, you know, going back to announcing on that debate stage, I am going to choose a woman to be my partner.
Right.
You know, in some ways, I think people were not surprised because it was very, very hard to imagine someone in Biden's position ultimately not choosing a woman, but it was a very sort of calculated decision early on to make that announcement and make that promise. And I certainly do understand the argument from some people who heard that and heard it as, well, isn't that a little patronizing? Isn't that a little, you know, pandering? Shouldn't it be not about gender, but about the person who is most accomplished? And of course, Biden's response to that was, well, I'm certain that there are many, many women who are, you know, extremely accomplished and ready to be president. And so I'm, you know, making the promise early on that the next vice president really should be a woman.
And how much do you think the fact that he emerged as the nominee out of a field that included 6 women, how much of that do you think weighed on his mind in order to kind of make that promise to start off with?
I think that must have been a huge factor.
Yeah,
because it's what the country saw, right? As I said before, started the 2020 campaign by covering Elizabeth Warren. And she was not just the woman in the race, but she happened to be one of so many women in the race. And, you know, not just some, you know, she's over here and the men are over and the serious candidates are all male and they're over here. Like, she was really in the mix, as, you know, so was Kamala Harris until her campaign became less successful. So I think the fact that this was such a historic race for the Democrats, with multiple very serious, very accomplished in their own rights women candidates in the field, I think that was a really important and sort of prominent factor in the decision from Biden world to make sure that a woman was chosen.
Another person with a big portfolio is going to be the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden. What do you all, I know today there were reports that she's going to be a key part of this task force that Biden is planning on announcing to aimed at reuniting children that were separated from their parents at the border under the Trump era policies. But what do you see, you know, in terms of her kind of in a role, obviously keeping some of her professional obligations as a teacher, this whole debate that we saw a few weeks ago over doctor being in front of her name. What is your sense of her as a First Lady and as, you know, part of a power structure in the White House?
Yeah, I mean, I think as with so many things with the new administration, so much of this is going to be drawing that contrast between this administration and the prior administration. So, you know, I'm talking about the former First Lady, Melania Trump, and how sort of unusually sort of private, removed, sort of out of the public vision she was throughout the 4 years that Trump was at the White House. I think already we are seeing that, Jill Biden is going to be a very different kind of first lady and public figure. But that's not to say that that's so unusual. I think it is just that when you compare her to the last and most recent first lady that we had, that is a real contrast. I am curious to see how she juggles the fact that she's going to, continue teaching. She has said that that is important.
Right.
With whatever portfolio she, ends up prioritizing at the White House. But also keep in mind, she's also the former second lady of the country, right? She has been incredibly sort of involved in public life and, has had this experience for a number of years. So you would assume that the issues that she, that were really important to her during the Obama years, you can imagine that those issues have probably not changed very much for her.
Right. And I'm sure she will have quite the waiting list, right, on her classes that she's going to be teaching, right?
Well, I was thinking that for Doug Emhoff, too. Don't you want to,
exactly.
if you're
and, his role, too, as the first gentleman, watching all of that play out as well. I want to talk a little bit about the Biden agenda for women. If we're on the campaign website, I think that part of the website had like 30 pages of, proposals and positioning on, his agenda for women, quote unquote. What do you see in there that would give us a sense of maybe what the next 4 years are going to be like for women and girls under this administration and the kind of things that he is going to be prioritizing in that realm?
I mean, I think for now, as we talked about before, because COVID is just so front and center and there just is not a bigger sort of crisis that the administration is tackling with, such urgency. I think that is where we are seeing sort of the first clearest signs of how they plan on really tackling and separating out the ways in which a crisis like this one can affect women differently than men. And I'm stating something that is factual and is backed up by data. It's obviously unfortunate, but the reality is that throughout the pandemic, we have seen this virus and the economic crisis that has come with the virus affect women in worse ways than men, whether it's because, women just naturally have a bigger share of sort of domestic responsibilities, or, they are not able to continue working in the middle of this pandemic because they have to be the ones to stay at home and take care of their kids. We are just seeing how sort of devastating this virus has been for everyone, but for women especially, and people of color, those problems and issues have been exacerbated. And so I think that is why, even before inauguration, we saw the Biden team really drawing that distinction and really making the promise, right, to say, we know that there are different groups of people being affected in different ways. And, we want to make a concerted effort to make sure that our, policy ideas and policy proposals take that into account. I mean, the number of times that you hear the new administration, when they're talking about COVID and COVID relief and everything that they're going to do, use the word equity. That has been such a core sort of theme for them, making sure in everything that we do, we take into account the fact that different people have been affected differently, and women are obviously not an exception.
Yeah, and speaking of some of the interest groups that are kind of out there, with their policy agenda, there was a full-page ad in the New York Times today from Girls Who Code, signed on by several female celebrities and business leaders and activists, asking Biden to come up with a pandemic plan to actually pay mothers for the work that they do, called the Marshall Plan for Moms. What do you think about that idea? because as you mentioned, so much of what is going on now in terms of women in the workforce and the really outsized role that so many mothers are playing in terms of, educating their children and homeschooling and doing everything else that moms do, right? It's gotten, exacerbated by this.
Yeah, I mean, it's those are issues I've been thinking about more and more as I approach the point of becoming a first-time mom in a matter of
a few weeks.
In a few weeks. I just speaking personally, like when I think about this, like I know, and I'm, fully aware that like I fall in the group of women who are the luckiest of the luckiest, right? I have, the ability to keep my job and a newsroom and a workplace and bosses who are, very supportive of the fact that I'm about to go on maternity leave, which by the way is going to be fully paid, and I will have a number of months that I can take off while I transition into being a mom and taking care of a newborn. And, am fortunate enough to have a spouse who is also going to be able to take that kind of time off and, pay time off. And the reality is that is just not the average experience for so many moms and so many women. And, I don't think it's a political statement in any way to say there are certain things that, clearly would be beneficial for parents, families, especially new moms, to have benefits for them to have access to, parental paid time off. There are certain things like that I think, should be just more accessible and should be universal, because it is just so difficult for, people to juggle parenthood and having a family and everything that entails with being able to, work and make sure that you're able to provide properly for your family. So all of that to say, I would be very surprised if these issues were not, front and center for the Biden administration. I don't know how quickly that will happen, given that, again, the priority for them right now is so much, COVID focused and economic relief that is related to COVID. But that's not to say that these issues that we are talking about are not related to COVID as well. In fact, they are, very much compounded by the virus and the experience that we all have had over the last year.
Yeah, and obviously this is sort of with a political lens too, but, and especially during the campaign, I'm curious on just your reflections on this from having covered the campaign, this outreach to women voters being so important to that kind of Biden constituency, Black women especially, right? What did you see, during the campaign in terms of the outreach that the campaign did toward women? And I assume that, they're going to have to double down on some of that, because they're, always thinking ahead to the next election, right?
Yeah. And I think the really interesting thing that we saw in the 2020 cycle, obviously the Biden campaign did a ton of outreach specifically to women. And a part of their strategy was recognizing that particularly during the Trump years, the demographics of, who made up the Democratic Party versus the GOP, like really shifted. And so much of that had to do with women, right? Women and particularly college educated women. We talk about suburban women all the time on cable TV, but it really was true that this was sort of the core group that Democrats seized on because they saw that they were, leaving increasingly the Republican Party, the traditional Republican Party, as we have known it. And so I think the outreach that the Biden campaign did to women sort of took that into account and sort of tried to factor in you know, if we need to do, you know, X% better in X, Y, and Z states compared to Hillary Clinton, like who are the women who traditionally have voted Republican or, you know, have been on the fence before, but are, you know, sort of repulsed by what the GOP stands for, particularly under the Trump years. Like, what are the different ways in which we can win them over? Because we know for a fact that they are currently on the fence, or we can certainly try to win them over.
Yeah. I'm going to take a couple questions, and I just was skimming through, and there's a few points that I wanted to make sure to get to as well. And this is an example of that. Talking about media coverage of female politicians. This is a good question from Isabel. And she says, from your perspective as a political correspondent, do you feel like media coverage of women politicians and leaders is improving fast enough? And what kind of steps are media outlets doing taking to avoid kind of gendered stereotypes when covering women, which is obviously a major hurdle for women running for office and holding other leadership positions?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's genuinely tough, and I do think it's a work in progress. I think any other answer would not be sort of honest. You know, it's a dynamic that we grapple with a lot as reporters, and I think in newsrooms. And, you know, if we were to just go back to Kamala Harris as an example, we cover her you know, in different contexts, obviously in the 2020 context and Biden's decision to choose her. So much of it was about sort of the historic nature of this first, right? First woman vice president, first woman vice president who was also Black, who was also of South Asian descent. And I think rightfully so. I'm not saying that it is a mistake to not fully sort of recognize that and give that the proper due, because it really was history in the making. But I do think there has to be sort of this constant, you know, reassessment and reflection about, are we also making sure that we are covering this person who is the vice president for everything that she is, that isn't about, you know, what makes her a barrier breaking vice president. But I think that, you know, some of that is on the Biden administration and Harris herself, and what actually she is doing day to day, right? Like on a day when, you know, she is helping to swear in, you know, Janet Yellen, who is also making history as the first female Treasury Secretary. We're going to cover that and make sure that our viewers know this is why this moment and this visual is so significant. There are a lot of sort of firsts that are happening here.
Right.
But in addition to that, you know, there are going to be days, especially as we get, you know, further into the administration, where we're going to have to figure out. So like putting all of that aside, again, not to suggest that it isn't important, but putting all of that aside, like what is she accomplishing or what is she doing? What are the actions she's taking as a vice president? And also, you know, taking sort of a beat to ask ourselves, if she were a white male vice president, are there ways in which we would be covering her differently, or, you know, paying attention to her in sort of different ways? So I do think it is a juggling act. I do think it's going to take a while for us to get to.
Yeah, I mean, there's sensitivities on both sides of that, right?
Yeah, definitely. And we saw it throughout the primaries too. We were talking about the VP selection process, and, you know, the sort of concerns that some, you know, women especially voiced about whether they agreed with the decision on, you know, by Biden to sort of early on preemptively promise that he was going to choose a woman. So yeah,
which led to, you know, an array of women sort of being floated, and then all of them being picked apart bit by bit too throughout the process, which I didn't necessarily think was helpful either. But I mean, do you see that, I guess, you know, we're more and more aware of some of this that goes on in the media now. And I think people are more in tune to kind of, you know, if you see something, say something mentality, so that there are sort of these outside checks on, some of the, more gendered stereotyping kind of reporting that obviously we've seen in times past. Do you notice that as much as, we're just more attuned to kind of calling that out when something happens?
I mean, I do think because there, is more sensitivity around it, as you said. Yeah. And I also think that social media plays a huge role in this. When there's some kind of, controversy or something in the headlines that is rubbing women the wrong way, I do think there's, there's now this way for women to amplify each other's voices and make sure that there is, a big forum in which these conversations are being had. I'm thinking about even the whole controversy with Kamala Harris being on the Vogue cover, and whether, if he had been a male VP, would they have chosen a photo that looked, that casual, and was this, a certain kind of disrespect that only a woman could have gotten? I think all of that becomes all the more heated and ends up getting, that much more attention because people are on Twitter replying, to each other and retweeting each other's tweets. So yeah, I think it's the fact that we are in the year 2021 and all of those things are possible that that it seems like, and I think it's true, that women are more engaged than ever before in discussing and wanting to discuss these issues.
Yeah. Let's see. Here's a good question from Caitlin. She says, congrats on your new role, MJ. How do you see former presidential candidates like Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren fitting into the Biden administration? Had the Dems captured a larger Senate majority, do you think they would have had larger roles in or cabinet positions? I guess being sensitive to the fact that you can't take too many people out of the Senate, put them in the administration, and risk losing, the numbers in the Senate, right? Yeah,
I do think the answer to that question is yes. I'm not, I'm not saying that there's some specific cabinet role that Amy Klobuchar surely, would have gotten were it not for the makeup of the Senate. Same with Elizabeth Warren. But I do think that it would have been a lot easier and even possible for the Biden folks to consider members of the Senate to serve in his government had it not been for this, they didn't even know until very recently what exactly the makeup of the Senate would be. So it just kind of became, not even something they could consider seriously. To take anybody out of the Senate, take a Democrat out of the Senate to serve in his administration. Deb Haaland is an example of somebody. Obviously, she is a member of the House. Dynamics there are a little different in that they have Democrats have a slim majority in the House, but it's nothing like what the dynamics in the Senate in terms of the division. And I thought it was a very key sort of moment for her and her ultimately being chosen to be Interior Secretary when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, publicly said in the form of this, I think it was a memo or a letter where she said, she fully would support if Biden were to choose Haaland. That was a real endorsement from her, right? And then sort of an unusual move. And I thought kind of telling when that became public, it just seemed like, okay, she is making it clear to everybody, if you need to take, this one, person in my party out of the House, I will allow it and it will be okay. But I think that the dynamics in the Senate were, it was just too difficult for Democrats to mess with that.
And then what about their own political future, beyond, potential cabinet job in the future? I mean, let's say that just for the sake of discussion, Biden doesn't run again in 2024. Could we see, some of these other women actually challenging Vice President Harris for the nomination? Just to play out that part of the game, right?
It's so painful to be already talking about 2024.
It's never too early.
No, I think it really, really depends on what, whether Biden runs in 2024, but you're talking about the scenario where he doesn't. Yeah. In the scenario where he doesn't, I think it really, really depends on whether Kamala Harris runs, and also just what kind of vice president she has made herself to be in the next, 2-3 years. We know that that story, the 2024 cycle, is going to start in probably 2 years, though Betsy, you're starting earlier. But I truly do think that if she is in a position to launch her campaign, being able to say, look at my administration and everything that it has accomplished and everything that I have accomplished alongside President Biden. We have, ended the COVID pandemic. We were in the middle of an economic crisis, and now things are, back on track, and people are, feeling a lot better about just sort of the state of the country and, the state of the economy for our families. If she's even able to say those two things with confidence, and the administration is largely viewed as a success, then I think she is probably going to have an incredible platform to run on, in addition to the fact that she is already the sitting vice president.
And what about the Republican side? Caitlin had a question about that. Any targeted front runners for 2024? Could we see a Nikki Haley running? Who else is out there on the Republican side?
I think on the Republican side too, everything so depends on what happens with Donald Trump and what he decides to do. I'm not making any predictions about, I do not think it is a foregone conclusion that he will definitely run in 2024. I think there are a lot of reasons why actually he ultimately will not, including, legal troubles, financial troubles that are clearly, very much on the horizon for him. I do think that we can easily see a scenario based on what we know about Donald Trump, where he sort of floats the idea and dangles the possibility of running for a really long time, making things really complicated for, any other Republican with even the smallest, aspiration to potentially consider running for president in 2024. They are all going to be watching him for cues on what he is going to do. Mm-hmm. Obviously, sort of whether you are able to get support from him, and whether for some of these candidates, it's important for them to feel like they are sort of tapping into the base that is Donald Trump's base. That is going to be a huge factor too. And I just think it is too early to know how we're not even into the second Donald Trump impeachment trial yet, right? We don't know how that's going to shake out. Right. Though, right now it does seem like it's going to be difficult for Democrats to secure a conviction. But again, we truly don't know. And I think so much of how 2024 shakes out on the Republican side will have to do with what happens with Donald Trump. But I do think in terms of women Republican candidates, Nikki Haley is probably the one that whose name comes up the most.
Well, and we've seen Trump now even just engaging already in 2022. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, former White House press secretary, of course, announced her bid the other day to run for governor, no surprise, of Arkansas, with a nice endorsement from President Trump along the way. Right. What do you think about Sarah Huckabee Sanders moving from the press secretary job into the governor's mansion in Arkansas, of course, a position that her dad obviously held for many years. It's so, she's such a fascinating example of what it can mean to be a sort of a successful Republican candidate in the age of Trump. She is somebody who has never run for office. She has not been an elected official.
has not had, executive experience. The Sarah Huckabee Sanders brand is the Donald Trump brand, right? She is known as having been his spokesperson, his defender, sort of the face of the White House.
Yeah, literally the face of the White House.
Literally the face of the White House. And as soon as she made the announcement, she got the coveted Trump endorsement. And this is not a race that I am going to pretend I've followed closely, but it does seem like, at least for now, she is going to emerge the front runner in whatever, primary race there ends up being in the state. I mean, that's like pretty amazing that because you were the person who, worked for Trump and, you were on national television defending, everything that the president was doing and many things that a lot of people thought, should not be defensible. Mm-hmm. Here you have now able to launch a credible campaign to be governor of a state. Like that's pretty amazing.
Right. But she was one of the few people that left on a high note, as we recall. I mean, she was not fired over Twitter. Like she left, with the blessing, right, of that Trump political machine. And so, no surprise that she's going to try to capitalize on that. Let's see. We have a question from Lynn Olson, a colleague of ours. She says, I think Samantha Power is the first heavy hitter to ever head USAID. It's always been sort of a backwater. I'm expecting a higher profile and more impact on the world because of her. What do you think?
I mean, I would basically agree with that, but I will not pretend to know a lot about sort of the dynamics of that specific role. So
let's see, a couple other questions here. Let's see, we talked about Kamala. This is another question on the media. Tyler's asking, how do you hope trust in the news media is back after years of people believing it to be fake news if it doesn't align with their views? So yeah, we talked about sort of the fake news era from the White House podium, maybe turning the page, but how does the media restore confidence after the last 4 years of being targeted as fake news from the Trump White House?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I get asked this question a lot, and I always give the same answer, and I just don't know how satisfying people find it. And it genuinely, honestly, is to just keep doing our jobs the best that we can. I just don't think there was anything that reporters and newsrooms could have done differently when we were, under sort of constant attack for being fake news. And again, those attacks coming directly from the president of the United States. I think we, had to find specific ways of covering the Trump administration and the Trump years, because we grappled on a daily basis with the lines just being so blurred between what was truthful and what was not, coming from the president himself and those around him. But like I am really proud of the newsroom that I work in, and especially my colleagues at the White House who covered the former administration day in and day out. And I think the most important thing that we could have done, and I think my colleagues tried to do every single day that they were covering the administration, was just to be really straight and direct every time they went on air or every time they wrote a story for CNN.com, which is just to say, this is what happened today, this is what President Trump said today, and here's what is wrong or correct or problematic about all of the above. And I just think we have to continue doing that with the new administration. But I think that was sort of always the plan, right? It's not as though there's some new, there's an adjustment to how we are going to do journalism or report on the new administration, simply because the last 4 years were sort of uniquely challenging.
One more media question for you. This is from Alex, who asked, please comment on the status of women in the media. It still feels very male-dominated in many ways. What are your thoughts on women in front of the camera, and then also obviously behind the scenes in some of the executive roles as well?
I guess I would just say, I know there's always progress that can be made, but I actually happen to disagree with the assessment that, at least just from my vantage point, that media tends to be heavily male dominated. I think there are parts of media certainly that are more male dominated, but if I'm speaking from just my own experience of having covered the campaign and now obviously the White House, I mean, even going back to 2016 when I covered the Hillary Clinton campaign, you look around the press plane and like there were, I think, more women than there were men. I think the same could be said of my experience covering Elizabeth Warren's campaign. And I think that there were plenty of women covering the Biden campaign as well. If you look at the White House press briefings that have happened so far in the first week and see the, people who are in the room, the reporters who are in the room, like there are plenty of women. And I think, when you are, taking into account television news specifically, it's obviously a very, visual, and you see right away, well, how many female reporters versus male. Just speaking for, CNN and our newsroom, like I think we have great diversity in terms of, gender. I think that we can always do a better job. And I don't think any of my, bosses would say anything differently.
Yeah. Before we go, I want to let everybody know about a couple of other programs we have coming up for our Women in Wednesdays. Next Wednesday, we invite you to join us for what I think will be a fun discussion with newly elected member Kathy Manning of North Carolina and her daughter, Jenny Kaplan, who has a terrific podcast on Wonder Media Network called Women Belong in the House, which she started when her mom ran, I believe, for Congress the first go around in 2018. So it'll be fun to hear from the two of them on next Wednesday. And then we have a few other upcoming dates for you. We have, let's see, coming up, our first male Women on Wednesdays guest, Dan Moraine, who has just written a new book on Kamala Harris called Kamala's Way. On February 24th, we have him coming. And then for International Women's Day, we have a great program with Gail Zemak-Lamon, who has just written a new book. It's not even out yet, called The Daughters of Kobani. It's already been optioned to make into a television series by Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton's new production company. And that we will discuss on March 3rd. So we invite you to join us for both of those three events, and follow our newsletter, and we will have, of course, more information, registration information there. But MJ, thank you for being with us tonight. We really appreciate all of your insights and the look behind the scenes, behind the curtain, if you will, on the Biden administration. And we will love to have you back as we kind of get into some of the more media aspects of what the Biden administration is doing, over the next few months. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was great. And thank you all for tuning in and for the great questions too.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the great questions. And we hope to see everybody next week. Good night.